The closure of MG's factory in Abingdon in 1980 was a real low point for the British car industry. The sales success of the 50s and 60s had long been forgotten as people started to move towards hot hatches instead of coupes and roadsters, and therefore the marque died in 1980. But the badge stayed alive throughout the 80s with warmed up family favourites such as the Metro, the Maestro and the Montego. We thought we'd take a drive in these two examples to see if they deserve that MG badge on the nose.
Let's go. Right, so here we are, MG Maestro, otherwise known as the Austin Maestro. Obviously this being its sportier counterpart, badge engineered by our good friends over at MG during what was a rather rough period, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it's safe to say that this is a classic British car industry story of cars that were very elongated in their development cycle, and by the time they came out they're already quite dated, played with industrial relations challenges.
Yeah, that was always the problem with BL, wasn't it? There was a lot of infighting and it was rather tough to have any particular brand find its own niche because everyone was sort of competing for the same market and stealing sales from under each other's noses, especially in the later years. But this era of MG is one that's not perhaps regarded with the greatest love, is it?
I think the problem is that by the time the Maestro comes out in 1983, the original concept was designed 8 years earlier in 1975, right?
Yeah.
And actually the MG badge version was a little bit of an afterthought, and they only spooled that up about a year or so before on sale of the Austin Maestro. Yeah. Because they'd launched the MG Metro and that had done quite well. And there was an issue with I think the Austin badge by that point had an image problem. It did. For the older, more sensible customer.
It was a way of sort of boosting up the profitability of Austin at the time, wasn't it? Make it a little bit of a sporty version.
It means that you put an MG badge on it, you make it a bit sportier, you make it appeal to a younger buyer. I mean, I don't know whether they necessarily were successful in that, but I mean, it looks kind of cool.
It definitely looks cool, but it was just as a bit of an era in general. It was quite rough. I mean, we started off with Abingdon being closed in the 80s, or in 1980 rather.
Yep. And
at the time, the Americans were in the process of banning MG's bread and butter, the open-top sports car, which gave us things like the 911 Targa and the Stag with its funny little roll bar setup and all that sort of thing. So that was another issue.
Well, they'd already ruined the MGs with the rubber bumper thing because of the crash impact and ride heights and all that kind of thing. That's another thing as well. It was all sort of death by 1,000 cuts, although not quite death. It survived onwards as a sort of zombie badge, not necessarily as a brand unto itself, but more as a variation on other cars. Just before the Abingdon factory was closed, I think they were down to a 3-day working week anyway. So clearly the demand for the MGB and the midget by then was so low.
Yeah.
But crucially, things like the Golf GTI comes out in 1976, right? And I think people prefer the practicality and the performance of a hot hatch over
that's another thing, because
slightly antiquated roadster or coupe.
Again, in the 70s, we had that big American oil crisis as well, didn't we?
Yeah.
So obviously, with gas prices going through the roof, Americans trended towards more economical automobiles, as it were, and all the things with big V8s and such just got hamstrung to the point where it wasn't producing any power just to meet emissions standards. That's where Japan sneaked in, and I guess the folks over at BL figured that they had to also fit into that and pivot towards more of a hatchback oriented design, which is why the saloon car was also sort of faded out after the 1100 until it came back with your little Montego. So being the sporting option then, how did that work out? So this little Maestro was offered with 3 engine options, the first being the 1600, which by no means was slow actually. For the time they were quite quick. I mean, the 1600 managed to break the 10-second barrier to 60, which was very impressive. And then there was this, the 2-litre EFI. Again, a little bit peppier, but nothing crazy. But then we get on to some of the crazy stuff like the turbo, which then brought that 0 to 60 down to 6.8 seconds.
I know, that's insane, isn't it?
And remains the quickest MG in a straight line until 2003, when it was beaten by a V8. So I think it actually did pretty well as far as sporting credentials go. And
it was a mad car. They didn't build many of the turbos, did they? But
no, it was 505, 500 for the public and 5 for press. We've got a little slalom course here. Oh, the steering box is a little bit slow, but once you get around, it's really not that bad. I was trying to understeer it there, and it did a little bit, but it kept in line pretty well.
And you can tell I'm old because I'm actually quite liking the ride comfort at this point. But
that's another thing that's quite remarkable about this. The steering isn't the most communicative, but despite being a relatively soft and comfortably sprung suspension setup, it still holds its line very well. And yes, we were door handling a little bit, but going over some of these bigger bumps, it just sort of irons them out. It was a very nice place to be. Now, one thing that makes it a little less nice of a place to be, and is quite indicative of the 80s car in general, is the interior build quality. That's another thing that went against a lot of the British sports car manufacturers that were used to traditional, wood veneer here, leather there. Here we have these lovely, sort of buckety velour seats, but the interior plastics aren't great. Things are a bit rattly. That tailgate
and this is the facelifted dash from '86. This isn't even the original kind of slightly.
It was probably a little bit worse than this
planky prototype one from the early cars.
But even the early cars had some pioneering features. They were one of the first cars to have a bonded laminated windscreen for starters, very nice. We had adjustable top mounts for seat belts for safety and for your comfort. We also had an electronic dash. Hello, Mr. Forklift. An electronic dash that would have a digital speed readout in the Van den Pla and MG models, especially the early ones. And if you really wanted to get your Night Rider on, you could have a dash that spoke to you.
The lovely
give you spoken information and warnings too.
The lovely Nicolette Mackenzie in her New Zealand voice.
Sounds like someone might have a crush.
Telling you to put your seatbelt on, and I don't know. I mean, clearly that technology didn't last, because by the time you get to this facelifted dash 3 years later, it's all gone. You've got regular dials all shared with the Montego and everything. But I loved all that technology. I think I can't remember who it was in the development team that wanted all that technology as a very visual reminder that this was a modern car, because it had been so long in the gestation, and there was fears it was just going to be a slightly bland Allegro replacement. So the technology stuff was a real statement to say this is a modern family hatchback, and I'm not sure it was entirely the right move in the end, given its troublesome reliability. And like you say, we're driving along. These are fairly bumpy roads, but it feels like we've got a militia of mice in the back. It's sort of so squeaky, and you know what I mean?
They are a bit in uproar, aren't they? Those little critters
it really
back there.
is.
Yes.
So it's not ideal, and the door cards feel a bit flimsy, and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I think some of those reliability and quality issues definitely plagued the reputation of the car early on, as did so many sort of BL products spawned of the 70s and 80s.
So the latter half of this car's life, through from 86 to 94, was all underneath the Rover Group. So BL was no more.
Well, and we lost the Austin badges. It was just known as Maestro and Montego, of course. By then, here's the thing, right? Is that MG, as part of Austin and everything else, was in the hands of the government, who had given them loads of money since the mid-70s. And I think they just felt the pressure to get these cars out quickly. And of course, I think that ultimately, hindsight being the wonderful thing that it is, proved to be a mistake, right? But by the time you get to this, the 2-litre, it's actually not a bad car.
It's not bad at all. It's not bad at all. It's decent in a straight line. Again, that handling isn't bad at all. But having said all this about engines and such, and platform sharing, this, that and the other, perhaps it's time that we switch over to your driving.
Let's go and get the more mature, more sophisticated MG, the lovely Montego saloon. So here we are then, Lucas.
Indeed we are.
In the MG Montego.
Whoa.
Not just any old Montego, the MG Montego. Now, very much a bit like the Maestro, my personal opinion with this is that it's all about the base car itself, and how good the base car is. And the Montego, I think, just had a really difficult gestation period, as again a lot of BL cars of that era did, because for a start it had the difficult job of replacing both the Ambassador and the Ital.
Yes.
Two cars that were probably long outstayed their welcome by the time they were finally replaced by this in 1984. But they also had this issue where they, obviously to save money, it was based on the MG Maestro, so therefore the centre section is effectively a Maestro.
Yes.
Then they've tried to sort of graft new front and rear sections on, and that's sort of problematic, because they then had to sort of graft an extra glass area behind the C-pillar to have the length for the boot.
The little weird quarter.
But the no glass line of the Maestro meant that they had to sort of cheat the window line and give it a slightly odd-looking boot lid type function.
Yeah, it's an odd-looking thing from the from the inside, probably more so from the outside. But sitting in the back to get that camera in there, it does feel identical to that Maestro.
Yes, and so basically the middle section is the David Bache designed Maestro.
Yes.
Now he gets politely let go in 1981, and Roy Axe of Roots fame.
What a name.
And exactly, yes. If you're going to get given the chop, then you might as well be replaced by Roy Axe, right? But anyway, he then grafted on what we now see as the Montego nose to give it that slightly more sort of pointy, sleeker front end to compared to the bluff front end that you get with the Maestro, and kind of refine that rear glass area, which then becomes quite distinctively Montego. But I seem to remember interviews back in the day of Roy Axe sort of lamenting that the Montego design couldn't have been better. You know, I think they wanted to design this centre section, redesign it entirely, but there wasn't the time nor the budget. You know, your base product starts with being relatively compromised. So then you bring out the MG badge version to give, I say, that appeal to the younger buyer, and you've got slightly awkward looks and things like that. But its biggest problem, the MG Montegos, was that it was relatively compact, but trying to compete against the Sierra and the Cavalier. Both of which were quite critically well received, selling in greater numbers, and the Sierra in particular
had that reputation, didn't it?
Well, the Sierra obviously had not only the Ford marketing might and dealer network, but they were discounting them really heavily because they were trying to get them out the door, and then that kind of undercut the Montego and made it look quite expensive in comparison. But you know, we've got this example here, 1988 example. Again, they've ironed out all the kinks. We've got the 2-litre O series engine. It's a nice engine. You know, it's actually quite refined.
It's quite sweet once you get.
I'm not going to do my Sweeney-esque driving that you were doing in the Maestro. I'm going to just politely swoop round like I'm looking for the parking space closest to the toilets at Toddington Services. That's what I'm doing. So I'm just driving along and enjoying my sporty executive express.
Watching the world go by.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, the Montego benefited from the newer interior.
Yes.
That's another Axe influence, I believe, because he never liked the original Maestro dashboard. So the Montego got this, I think, more polished interior.
Yeah, it is a little bit nicer in here. And again, if we stop and listen for a second, there's quite a lot less rattling too. Okay, there's probably a window regulator going on in my door, but aside from that, it's a lot better put together, at least feeling-wise, than the
and I think we get the Honda gearbox at this stage rather than the VW derived one.
I see.
There's also these conspiracy theories that VW had somehow made the gearbox worse, so that it hamstrung the Maestro, which of course was competing with the Golf, which is madness. I don't believe for a second that that's what they were doing.
No, I doubt that very much.
But anyway, this is quite a nice, sweet 5-speed gearbox as it goes. Yeah. And like you're saying with the Maestro, the steering is, I would say, a little bit woolly. It's got no feel to it really.
No.
And it's well weighted on the move. Yeah, it's really heavy at parking speeds. I've got to say.
Direct enough.
Yeah. It's heavy at parking speed, so that's not fun. It's not power assisted.
No.
And it feels a little bit firmer than the Maestro actually. I think whether that's just the suspension setting on this particular example.
Yeah, it could just be an age thing for the Maestro, but it does feel a little bit tauter in a strange sort of ways, which is odd considering it's actually extended over that car.
Yeah.
You'd expect it to be a little floppier.
That's the Montego in a nutshell. And of course, like you said earlier, when it becomes effectively the Rover Group in '86, the Austin badges disappear, so you end up with just Montego as the sort of value offering.
Yes.
Because I think by then the Rover 200, the SD3 model, was outselling the Montego. Then the R8 comes out in 1989.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, you know, anything Austin badged or Austin derived, which of course the MG Montego still is kind of on a bit of a hiding to nothing. And, you know, they added diesel engines and other things like that to the Montego lineup to sort of continue its appeal. But ultimately, you're on borrowed time. And
clutching at straws, really. It was sort of last ditch.
I don't know. The MG Montego, I think is actually quite a nice product, but quite nice is probably
wasn't enough.
It's not good enough when you're suddenly seeing a rise of you know, the E30 BMW 3 Series, you know, the Mercedes 190, even those premium products were now starting to enter the company car arena.
The world was just running away from them, really, wasn't it?
You know, this is a 1988 car. They've got the Peugeot 405 out by then as well.
Yeah.
You know, really good cars.
Yeah.
And this just wasn't up to scratch in comparison. So I suppose the big question I want to ask, Lucas, is that we've driven these 2 MG badged cars from the 1980s. Does the Maestro and Montego live up to the MG badge as we know and believe it to be? You know, this is a famed mark for modifying old Morris cars and then developing iconic sports cars like the MGA and the MGB and the Midget and the MGC and all these many other great cars, you know.
Well, if you're going to pick a perfect MG, right, it has to be front engine, good, rear wheel drive, open top,
yeah.
It's not an MG as we would traditionally know and love, but even still later on we ended up getting things like the ZT and the ZS, neither of which were open top, but they did come back with the F. So really it's a strange period in MG's life, but as a period, I still think they were kicking out some of the more interesting cars that BR had to offer, especially on the sporting end of things. And being able to do, you know, being able to make a Maestro out of an MG Maestro out of an Elston one, they did actually add value. And it may not have been the most successful sports car in the world, but it was still sporty enough to get them by. So I think personally it counts as a proper MG, especially considering what the brand is making now, dare I mention. It's
that's a good point. Yeah.
it's a heck of a lot better than that as we go past actually an MG4.
There we go, the MG4 there, yeah. The I don't know, I personally, because I still have such a high regard for those sports cars of their halcyon days, I don't think they live up to it. I think they're quite a cynical marketing exercise, but the fact that they could do it and could sell them and they did have appeal is testimony to the strength of the MG mark, I think. And the fact that they endured throughout the 80s right up until 92, 93 when the RV8 comes out, and then the MG revival can properly get underway, and then, like you say, that spawns the MGF, which is a proper sports car. And to be fair, even the MG badge things like 75, I think the MG ZT, that is, I think are decent cars. You know, it's just that I think, you know, the MG Montego was always going to be hamstrung by the product on which it was based. So
this is true,
and I think that's true of the Maestro. You know, so
it really is just indicative of the time, I reckon. And judging by the way the time treated much of the other cars of the BL stable, I think this came out all right.
Yes,
so,
it's all right. It's
the best you could probably give it.
It's a 7 out of 10.
Yes.
Right. It's a C plus.
Certainly passable.
Yes, I think that's it.
But not with flying colours.
I don't know, but maybe we're being too harsh. You know, dear viewers, tell us what you think. I mean, maybe you love the MG Maestro and Montego. Maybe you own one.
Please drop a comment and tell us what's what if you think we're full of something. But in any case, speaking of which, thank you ever so much for watching. Do feel free to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell if you want to see these videos as they are released, and drop that comment telling us where to go. And in the meantime, we're going to do just that. So, ta-ra.
See you soon. Feel the skin pulling back with the performance.
Don't say that. I can feel the skin pulling back.
Yeah, I know, that's wrong, isn't it? It's probably a better expression.
Yes, perhaps.